It's April 10th, 1734, and Montreal is on fire. By the time the flames are extinguished, 45 buildings have burned down, the entire Merchants Quarter. Everything you see around me, ashes. The Hotel Dieu, one of North America's very oldest hospitals, is consumed by the blaze. The nuns who run it race into the streets with their patients. Montreal's worst nightmare has been realized, and the cause is arson. A woman who lived here, Marie-Joseph Angélique, is tortured and hanged for the crime. But today, that convicted arsonist is a celebrated historical figure. And the story of how that happened is a disturbing tale from one of the darkest chapters in our country's history. This is Canadiana. Marie-Joseph Angélique was a Canadian slave. The history of slavery in Canada is too often overlooked, but we had more than our fair share of it. More than 4,000 people were enslaved in New France and the British colonies before the practice was finally abolished. Slavery up here looked quite a bit different than it did on the southern plantations of the 13 colonies. In Canada, the enslaved were usually confined to urban areas, forced to act as servants to the elites. Many were black, taken from overseas or south of the border, while many others were called panis, indigenous people captured in battle and then made personal property. Angélique was originally from Madeira, but forced into slavery. She was sold to a Montreal couple when she was just a young woman. She was bought by François Poulain de Francheville and his wife Thérèse, who lived here on the Rue Saint-Paul, just across the street from the Hotel Dieu. Angélique's life in Montreal was unsurprisingly horrific. The Franchevilles were even suspected of forcing her to carry the children of another black slave. All 3 of her babies died within months of their birth. But at the end of 1733, there was finally some good news, a smallpox epidemic. It killed hundreds of people in Montreal, including François Poulain de Francheville. Angélique had been promised her freedom upon François' death, possibly a twisted bargain made as part of years of sexual abuse. There was finally some light at the end of the tunnel. There was still one person standing in her way, the widow Francheville. She wasn't about to let Angélique go. She wanted to get her money's worth. Angélique fought back. She demanded her freedom and seems to have threatened the widow with burning and roasting. But the widow Francheville still refused. Instead, she was going to sell her. So Angélique began to plot an escape with her lover, a convict named Claude Thibault. He was a smuggler from France who had been arrested and exiled to Canada, where he ended up becoming the widow's indentured servant. Together, the couple came up with a plan. They would escape and find a ship in New England that was headed for Europe. Marie-Joseph Angélique wanted to go home. They would need to hurry. In February, things grew dire. The widow sold Angélique to a man in Quebec City for 600 pounds of gunpowder. The sale would go through as soon as the St. Lawrence thawed, allowing Angélique to be shipped downriver. With the clock of the spring melt ticking, she and Claude had to act fast. Angélique set her bed on fire, a distraction as she and Claude ran off across the frozen river under the cover of darkness. But they didn't get far. The police quickly hunted them down, returned Angélique to the widow, and threw Claude in jail. He wouldn't get out until the day of the next fire. That night, there was an evening mass. Many of Montreal's 2,000 inhabitants were there. Back on Rue Saint-Paul, Angélique waited outside for the widow to return from the service. She was with her friend, Marie Manon, an enslaved panis woman who worked next door. They played a game to pass the time, seeing who could run across the street to the Hotel Dieu the fastest. A soldier stood in the door to the hospital. A few children played in the street. Suddenly, the soldier yelled, "Fire!" Rue Saint-Paul was burning. All hell broke loose. There were evacuations, looters, bucket brigades trying to quash the flames. Amazingly, no one was killed, but many, including the neighborhood's poorest residents, were left homeless. In the wake of the disaster, a rumor began to spread. Some claimed they'd heard Angélique say,
Ma maîtresse ne couchera pas dans sa maison ce soir.
It was the rumor that sealed her fate. The city was reeling, looking for someone to blame. Angélique was arrested immediately and charged with arson, a crime punishable by death. Many witnesses claimed they'd seen the fire start in the attic of the widow Francheville's home. And in a colony where lawyers had been banned by King Louis XIV, it was up to Angélique to defend herself. It was her word against hearsay. One after another, 23 of the 24 witnesses told basically the same story. They all heard the rumor. Angélique had bragged that the widow would not be sleeping at home. The source of the rumor was Marie Manon, the Pani slave from next door. But 6 weeks into the inquiry, the prosecution still needed something more substantial than that. Like, say, a confession extracted by torture. So that's what they were gonna get, until a new witness was uncovered. It was the widow's own 5-year-old niece who told the judge she'd seen Angélique head up to the attic with a shovel full of coal. The little girl looked at Angélique and said,
Tu es montée en haut.
That was it. Angélique was sentenced to have her hands cut off and then be burned alive at the stake. After a pathetic excuse of an appeal, her sentence was lessened. She would be hanged and then burned. But first, she would be tortured. You see, a death sentence wasn't enough. Her lover, Claude Thibault, he'd vanished without a trace, never to be seen again. They wanted to know whether he or anyone else had acted as her accomplice. So they brought out the boot, a medieval torture device. They enlisted another black slave to perform the procedure. Mathieu Levet had been convicted of murder in the Caribbean, and they gave him a choice: be executed or become an executioner. He placed 2 wooden boards on either side of Angélique's legs and tied a rope around them tight. Then he hammered a wedge between her knees. As he drove the wedge down, her bones were crushed. They called this ordinary torture. Angélique confessed, saying she had set the fire, but insisted that she'd acted alone. So Levet took another wedge and drove it between her ankles. This they called extraordinary torture. He brought the hammer down again 4 times. Angélique repeated her confession and begged to be put out of her misery. Broken and suffering, she was loaded onto a cart and brought here to the famous Notre Dame. She carried a torch in one hand and a sign that said Incendiaire. She was paraded before the crowd and then taken inside and made to confess her sins to God. Her torturer became her executioner. Levet brought Angélique to be hanged in front of the ruins of the fire. Her body was kept there on public display for hours after she took her final breath, until finally, with the same torch she had carried to the gallows, they burned her lifeless body and scattered her ashes to the wind. The story of the executed slave was buried over the next 2 centuries, forgotten in favor of tales of Canada's role in the Underground Railroad. That is the slavery narrative we prefer to tell ourselves. It wasn't until recently that historians unearthed the preserved documents of the trial, helping to shed light on one of Canada's darkest episodes. Marie-Joseph Angélique has become an inspiration to many. Immortalized in paintings, plays, and myths, she's become a symbol of resistance, still lighting fires, more than 200 years after her death. Not everyone thinks Angélique is the one who set the fire. Remember Marie Manon, the Pani woman who lived next door and who started the rumor that sealed Angélique's fate? Well, lots of people think she's the one who may have been responsible for the blaze. She might have started it accidentally in a stove while she was cooking next door. We'll never know for sure, but you can learn more about the mystery by following the links we'll post in the description below. If you liked this video and you'd like to see more, please subscribe. We have lots more stories to tell you, but to do it, we'll need your help. You can become a regular supporter by becoming a patron on Patreon, or you can give us a one-time donation through PayPal. Every little bit helps. You can also follow us on social media at ThisIsCanadiana. Thank you so much. I'm Adam Bunch. I'll see you next time on Canadiana.